he didn't do it alone. Andres stood beside him the whole night, translating dense research into the language of men who'd spent their lives reading currents instead of graphs, and something in the town's collective posture shifted as they watched the two of them work as a team, steady, competent, clearly devoted to the same thing, and clearly devoted to each other. Old T.O. Herminio, 91 years old and the last man alive who remembered when the reef used to be twice its current size, stood up at the end and said the thing that turned the tide of the whole meeting. "I've watched this coast my whole life," he said, voice creaking like the boats he used to captain. "I've watched it shrink because we let outsiders decide what it's worth. I say we don't sell it. Not to Cardenas, not to anyone." And his eyes found Rigoberto across the room, sharp despite his age. "I say Rigoberto Valdez owes this town an apology for trying to sell what was never only his to sell." The vote that followed wasn't close. Rigoberto found his son on the dock afterward, alone, watching the moon lay a silver path across water that would, for now, stay wild. "I withdrew from the deal," Rigoberto said, gruff, not looking at Andres directly. "Cardenas isn't happy. He'll try to buy someone else's shoreline instead, probably. But not ours." "Thank you," Andres said. "I'm not doing it for thanks." His father was quiet a long moment, hands shoved deep in his pockets, looking older than Andres had ever seen him look. "Your grandfather used to say the sea doesn't care what a man wants. It only cares what he's willing to protect." He finally looked at his son. "I think I forgot that. I think I got so scared of losing this family's future that I almost sold the only thing that ever made it worth having." Andres's throat tightened. "Papa. I'm not going to pretend I understand everything about you and the Reyes boy," Rigoberto said, awkward, forcing the words out like they cost him something. "But I watched you stand up in that meeting like the man I always hoped you'd become. Steady. Sure of what you believe in." He cleared his throat hard. "Your mother would have liked him, I think. She always did." It wasn't an apology, not exactly. It wasn't full acceptance either. But it was a door easing open instead of slamming shut, and for Andres, after everything, it was enough to breathe around for the first time in months. Marisol married someone else 11 months later, a kind marine engineer from Ensenada who looked at her the way Andres never had, and she sent Andres a photo from the wedding with a note that just said, "See? Honest was better for both of us." Nacho's research grant, once threatened by a resort that never got built, was extended for 3 more years, funded in part by a new conservation partnership the whole town voted to support. He didn't have to choose between the reef and Punta Serena anymore, because Punta Serena had chosen the reef right alongside him. And Andres finally understood what his father meant about the sea only caring what a man was willing to protect. He'd spent so many years protecting the safe version of his life that he'd nearly let the real one drown. The proposal happened on the same rocks past the lighthouse where Nacho had first told a scared 17-year-old the truth about who he was, the same tide pools, the same salt air, 13 years and a whole lifetime of almost losing each other later. "I used to think love was supposed to be easy," Andres said, kneeling on wet stone with his hands shaking around a ring his mother had once worn, the ocean applauding softly against the rocks below them. "I don't think that anymore. I think love is choosing someone through every hard, complicated, terrifying part, and I choose you, Nacho. I chose you when I was 17 and too scared to say it. I choose you now, and I'm never going to be scared of saying it again." Nacho was crying before Andres even finished the sentence, both hands pressed over his mouth, the boy who'd once written "I'd rather lose you slowly than tell you the truth finally, fully, unafraid." "Yes," he said, before Andres could even finish asking. "Yes, 1,000 times yes. We fell in love and it was never easy, but I would choose every hard year of it again, every single time, if it means ending up right here." The whole town came to the wedding 6 months later, even Rigoberto, who walked his son down a flower-lined dock in front of 400 neighbors and, when asked to say a few words, could only manage, gruffly, "My son found the one thing in this life worth protecting. I'm glad he didn't give up before he found it." Then he hugged Nacho so hard the younger man laughed and cried at the same time, and the whole harbor erupted into applause. The reef, protected now for good, bloomed a little brighter every season after that, coral regrowing in slow, patient color, the same way Andres and Nacho's love had regrown from a single unopened letter into something that finally, got to be spoken out loud. You asked for it, and here it is, the final part of Nacho and Andres' story. If part 1 was about two men finding the courage to choose each other, part 2 is about what they built once the choosing was done. This is a story about healing journeys, chosen family, and the kind of love that doesn't just survive, it multiplies. Punta Serena hadn't changed much. That was the strange, quiet miracle of it. The reef Nacho had spent years protecting was thriving now, bright with regrowth, written up in 2 conservation journals and 1 glossy travel magazine that called it the coastline that said no to a resort and yes to itself. The Valdez boat shed had a new sign above the door. Valdez Reyes Charters, Research Support, Marine Tours. Rigoberto had grumbled about the hyphenated name for exactly 1 week before quietly, proudly, telling every fisherman at the harbor cafe that his son-in-law had a doctorate and knew more about the ocean than any of them. Andres still ran the boats. Nacho still chased data and coral samples, though these days half his research assistants were local kids from Punta Serena who'd grown up watching a marine biologist marry a fisherman's son and decided, quietly, that maybe there was room in this town for people like them too. They had been married 2 years, 4 months, and Andres liked to say, teasing an immeasurable number of days, because Nacho always lost count and always pretended he hadn't. Life was, against every odd either of them had once believed, easy now. It didn't stay that simple for long. But this time, they weren't facing the hard part alone. It was late July, hot and gold, the kind of evening when the whole harbor smelled like salt and grilled fish and somebody's radio playing an old cumbia 2 docks over, when Andres noticed the boy. He was maybe 16, sitting on the far edge of the pier with his knees pulled to his chest, a duffel bag beside him that had clearly been packed in a hurry. He'd been there since Andres closed up the boats that afternoon. He was still there at sunset. "You eaten today?" Andres asked, crouching down a respectful distance away, voice easy, the same voice he used to calm nervous first-time tourists on rough water. The boy looked up, startled, wary in a way that hit something old and familiar in Andres' chest. "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." The boy's jaw tightened, and then, all at once, the way a held breath finally breaks, his face crumpled. "My dad found messages on my phone," he said, voice cracking. "From a boy. He said I had until dark to get out of his house." Andres didn't say anything right away. He just sat down on the dock, an arm's length away, and let the boy cry it out in the fading gold light without an audience or a rush. Then he took out his phone and called Nacho. Nacho arrived 15 minutes later, still in his wetsuit from the afternoon survey dive, and when he saw the boy's face, saw the particular exhausted fear of a kid who'd just been told his own family didn't want him. Something old and tender moved behind his eyes. He sat down on the boy's other side. "My name's Nacho," he said gently. "What's yours?" "Emiliano." "Emiliano." Nacho nodded slowly, like he was memorizing something important. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to actually hear it, okay? Not just let it go in one ear." He waited until the boy looked at him. "I was 15 when my father threw me out of my own house for being exactly who I am. I thought that meant something was wrong with me. It took me a long time to understand it meant something was wrong with the way he loved, not with the way I existed." Emiliano's eyes filled again, but this time it wasn't only grief in them. It was the specific, fragile relief of being seen by someone who'd survived the exact same storm. "You're not sleeping on this dock tonight," Andres said quietly. "You're coming home with us. No conditions. No questions you're not ready to answer." Hooked for retention, neither Nacho nor Andres knew yet just how much that one decision, one boy, one dock, one act of unplanned kindness, was about to change the shape of their whole family. Emiliano stayed for what was meant to be one night. One night became a week. A week became the whole rest of that summer, then the school year, filled out with the local high school, with a room in the little blue house above the harbor that had been meant, someday, as storage, until Andres spent a weekend painting it a soft ocean green instead and Nacho hung string lights across the ceiling because Emiliano mentioned, once, offhand, that he used to be scared of the dark after his father's shouting. It wasn't a decision they announced with any formality. It simply became true, the way tides become the shoreline shape over enough years, gradually, and then it was simply how things were. Rigoberto, of all people, was the one who made it official in the town's eyes. He showed up one Sunday with a fishing rod half Emiliano's height and taught the boy to bait a hook with the same patient, gruff attention he'd once given his own son, and when someone at the Harbor Cafe asked whose grandson that was, Rigoberto answered without a beat of hesitation. "Mine," he said, and went back to his coffee like the matter had never been in question. Emiliano's father called, eventually, 3 months in, after the anger had burned down to something more complicated. He wanted to talk it through, he said. He wanted his son back. Emiliano, sitting at the kitchen table between the two men who'd built him a safe room without asking for anything in return, listened to the voicemail with his jaw tight and his hands shaking. "You don't have to decide anything tonight," Nacho said softly, setting a mug of hot chocolate in front of him, the same gesture, Andres realized with a quiet ache, that Nacho's own mother must have made for him once, all those years ago. "What if I go back and he does it again?" Emiliano's voice was small. "What if this is the only safe place I ever get, and I mess it up trying to fix something that isn't fixable?" Andres reached across the table, not touching, just present. "Then you come back here," he said simply. "This house doesn't run out of room for you. Not this year, not any year. That part isn't up for negotiation, not with your father, not with anyone." Emiliano didn't call his father back that night. He cried instead, and Nacho sat with him until the crying turned to something quieter, and Andres made more hot chocolate than any of them could reasonably finish, because it felt like the only useful thing his hands knew how to do in that moment. Emotional beat. That night, after Emiliano finally slept, Nacho stood on the porch a long time, looking out at the water. "You okay?" Andres asked, coming to stand beside him, wrapping an arm around his husband's shoulders against the cool night air. "I keep thinking about the boy I used to be," Nacho said quietly. "Sitting on a bus at 15 with everything I owned in one bag, terrified nobody was ever going to want me the way my own father was supposed to." He leaned into Andres' side, breath unsteady. "I didn't know, back then, that someday I'd get to be the person who makes sure another kid never has to feel that alone. That's a kind of healing I didn't know I needed until it happened." "You gave him what your mother gave you," Andres murmured against his hair. "And what I should have said to you, 13 years ago on those rocks, the very first time you told me who you were. You're still you, Nacho. Nothing about you was ever the thing that needed fixing." Nacho's father wrote a letter that autumn. Actual paper, actual ink, the first contact in 19 years. "I heard about the reef," it read, stiff and formal in the way of a man who'd never learned softer language. "I heard you married well. I heard you're doing good work down there. I don't know if I have the right to say I'm proud, after everything. But I am. I've been proud for a long time and too stubborn to say so. I'm sorry, Ignacio. I was wrong about you 19 years ago, and I've been wrong every year since that. I didn't tell you that." Nacho read the letter 4 times before he could speak. "You don't have to answer it," Andres said carefully, watching his husband's face for any sign of what he needed. "Not today. Not ever, if that's what's right for you." "I know." Nacho's voice was thick. "But I think I want to. Not for him. For the boy I used to be, who used to fall asleep every night hoping his father would say exactly this. I think that boy deserves to hear it, even 19 years late." He wrote back. It wasn't an instant reunion, wasn't a fairy tale ending stitched together in a single letter. Old wounds don't close that fast, and Nacho was careful, cautious, protective of the family he'd already built with his own 2 hands. But it was a beginning. A door left open instead of locked forever. His father came to visit for the first time the following spring, awkward and gray-haired and unsure where to put his hands, and stood on the dock watching his son dive for coral samples with a kind of quiet, aching wonder that looked almost like the pride he'd been too proud to voice for 19 years. He met Andres. He met Emiliano. He didn't say much. But when he shook Andres' hand, he held it a beat longer than necessary and said, roughly, "Take care of my son. He deserves it. I should have made sure of that a long time ago myself." Hook for retention, forgiveness, Nacho would say later, isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about deciding your future gets to be bigger than your wound. That decision changed something in all of them, but the biggest change was still coming. Emiliano turned 18 the following summer, on a warm evening with the whole harbor gathered on the Valdez dock for a celebration that had somehow, over 3 years, become the whole town's tradition. A boy who arrived with one duffel bag and a broken heart, grown now into a young man studying marine science on the same scholarship program that had once carried Nacho away from this very same dock. He stood up at the little party with a glass of sparkling cider raised high, nervous, his voice trembling exactly the way Nacho's had trembled on the rocks all those years ago, back when this whole story began. 3 years ago I sat on this dock with everything I owned in a bag, and I thought that was the end of my story, Emiliano said, looking at Andres, then at Nacho, then out at the whole assembled town that had folded him in without asking anything in return. Turns out it was the beginning of a better one. I used to think family was something you were born into. I know now it's something people choose to build for you, brick by brick, even when they don't have to. His voice cracked. Thank you for choosing me. Nacho was crying before Emiliano finished the sentence. Andres wasn't far behind him, one arm slung around his husband's shoulders, watching the boy they'd taken in become exactly the kind of man they'd hoped he could be, safe, whole, and unafraid to say out loud who he was. Rigoberto, standing at the edge of the crowd with a beer in his weathered hand, raised it toward the three of them and said nothing at all, because for once, nothing needed saying. That night, long after the party wound down, Andres and Nacho sat on the same rocks past the lighthouse where this whole story had first cracked open, where a scared 17-year-old had once confessed the truth about himself to his best friend, where a proposal had happened years later under a different, braver sky. We fell in love, and it was never easy, Andres said quietly, echoing the words that had started everything, watching moonlight lay silver across water that had asked nothing of them but honesty. I used to think that title was a warning. Now I think it was a promise. Easy things don't ask you to become someone stronger. Easy things don't build a family out of a boy on a dock and a father's unopened letter and a whole town choosing a reef over money. He looked at his husband, eyes bright. I wouldn't trade one hard year of it. Not one. Nacho leaned his head against Andres' shoulder, the ocean breathing quietly below them, the whole life they'd built together spread out behind them like a shoreline finally, fully, at peace with its own shape. Neither would I, he murmured. Not one single year. The tide came in, the way it always did in Punta Serena. It never asked permission. It simply arrived, softened everything it touched, and left the shore a little more beautiful than it found it, the same way, Nacho thought, love had arrived in both their lives. Uninvited, unstoppable, and, in the end, exactly what both of them needed to become whole. Thank you for finishing this journey with Nacho and Andres, from an unopened letter, to a storm on an island, to a reef saved, a family healed, and a boy on a dock who found a home he never thought he'd get to have. This is what a true LGBTQ love story looks like, hard-won, healing, and built to last. If this final part made your heart full, like this video red heart, comment your favorite moment from Nacho Andres' journey below. Subscribe for weekly gay romance stories, new heartfelt journeys every week. The tide in Punta Serena never asked permission. It came in when it wanted, pulled back when it wanted, and left the sand rearranged every single morning as if the sea itself refused to be predictable. Andres Valdez used to think that was the whole town's problem. Nothing here ever stayed the same shape for long. Not the coastline. Not his father's moods. Not the promises people made to each other under the palapa roofs when the beer was cold and the night was soft. He didn't know yet that the tide was about to bring something back to shore that he'd spent 6 years trying to forget. This is the story of We Fell in Love. But it was never easy, a story about two men, one small fishing town, and a love neither of them planned for and neither of them could walk away from twice. If you're here for a heartfelt gay romance, an emotional connection that took years to become brave enough to speak its name, and a healing journey soaked in salt air and second chances, settle in. This one's going to hurt a little before it heals a lot. Andres was 29 years old and mending the same net his father had mended at 29, and his grandfather before that, when he heard the boat engine that didn't belong to anyone in Punta Serena. He didn't look up right away. In a town of 400 people, you learned to recognize engines the way you recognized voices. This one was newer. Quieter. Careful with the reef in a way that told him whoever was driving it actually knew what lay beneath the water. Andres Valdez. The voice came from the dock, warm and low, carrying an accent that had softened at the edges from years spent somewhere else. You got taller. That shouldn't be possible. You were already too tall. His hands stopped moving on the net. He knew that voice before he let himself believe it. He turned, and there was Nacho Reyes standing on the weathered planks of the dock like he'd never left, except he had. 6 years, 2 months, and Andres had never counted. Of course he hadn't about 11 days. You're supposed to be in Mexico City, Andres said, because it was easier than saying anything true. I was. Nacho's mouth curved, uncertain, hopeful, scared, all three at once, the way it used to when they were 17 and testing the edges of something neither of them had a name for yet. Now I'm here. For the reef survey. 6 months, maybe longer. 6 months. Andres's chest did something complicated. Relief and dread, tangled together like fishing line left too long in a drawer. Well, he said, because his father was 40 feet away pretending not to listen, and the whole town would know within the hour regardless. Welcome home, I guess. Nacho's eyes, dark, steady, the same eyes that used to find Andres across every crowded room in this town, didn't leave his face. It doesn't feel like home yet, Nacho said softly. But it's starting to. If you want to understand why a grown man's hands were shaking over a fishing net, you have to go back 13 years, to when Andres Valdez was 16 and Ignacio Nacho Reyes was the strange, quiet boy who'd moved to Punta Serena with his mother after his father threw him out of the house in Guadalajara for the crime of being exactly who he was. Nacho didn't talk about it. Not then. Andres only knew because his own mother, God rest her, had made the Reyes family a pot of pozole the week they arrived and come home saying, quietly, that poor boy deserves better than what he got. Andres hadn't understood what that meant. Not fully. Not until the two of them were 17, sitting on the rocks past the lighthouse with their feet in the tide pools, and Nacho had gone very still and said, I need to tell you something, and I need you to still be my friend after. Andres remembered every second of what came after. The way Nacho's voice had trembled on the words. The way the ocean had seemed to hold its breath along with both of them. The way Andres had said, without having to think about it at all, you're still you. Nothing changes that. He hadn't told Nacho, that night or any night after, that somewhere in the months that followed, his own feelings had shifted into something he didn't have a name for either, something that scared him more than any storm the Pacific had ever thrown at his father's boat. They were 18 when Nacho left for university on a marine biology scholarship, the only way out of a town that offered him nothing but fishing nets and whispers. Andres had driven him to the bus station. Neither of them had said the thing that was sitting between them like a stone neither could lift. Write to me, Andres had said instead. I will, Nacho had promised. He had, for a while. And then the letters had thinned, and then stopped, and Andres had told himself that was just what happened when people grew up and grew apart, and he had buried the stone a little deeper every year after that. Now the stone was standing on his dock in a marine research polo shirt, 6 years older, and Andres didn't know if he had the strength to bury it again. Hook, but Andres wasn't the only Valdez with a reason to fear the ocean's return. His father, Don Rigoberto Valdez, had built the family's boat business with his own hands after Andres's grandfather drowned in a storm that took 3 other men from town with him. Rigoberto didn't trust easily, didn't change easily, and had exactly one plan for his only son, marry well, take over Valdez Fisheries, and give him grandchildren before his knees gave out from 40 years of hauling nets. That plan currently had a name. Marisol Herrera, daughter of the man who owned the ice plant and half the trucks that got Punta Serena's catch to market. A merger disguised as a marriage, and everyone in town knew it, including Marisol, who was kind enough and practical enough not to mind as long as Andres kept up appearances and didn't embarrass her. Andres had said yes to the engagement 8 months ago on a night he barely remembered the reasoning behind. It had felt, at the time, like the only door left open to him. A door that led somewhere safe, even if it didn't lead anywhere he actually wanted to go. He hadn't planned on the ocean handing him a second door. Nacho's research post was funded through a coastal conservation grant, studying the health of the barrier reef half a mile off Punta Serena, the same reef that had fed this town for 4 generations, and the same reef that was dying a little more every year from warming water, bleaching coral, and a resort developer named Esteban Cardenas who had recently started making very generous offers to buy up the shoreline. Andres knew about Cardenas's offers because his father had been meeting with the man in private for 3 weeks and hadn't told anyone. He didn't know that yet, either. Not fully. That reveal was still coming, and when it landed, it would nearly break this family in half. For now, all Andres knew was that Nacho needed a boat and a captain who knew the reef's currents better than the tourist charter companies, and that his father, practical, gruff, unable to turn down paying work, had volunteered Andres for the job before Andres could open his mouth to object. "You know these waters better than anyone left in this town," Rigoberto said, not quite needing his son's eyes. "Take the boy out. Get paid. Simple." The boy. As if Nacho were still 17. As if 6 years and a doctorate program hadn't happened at all. Andres wanted to argue. He didn't have the energy to explain why. The first week, they didn't talk about anything that mattered. Nacho cataloged coral samples. Andres steered the boat and adjusted the anchor and pretended his heart wasn't doing something unsteady every time Nacho surfaced from a dive with his wetsuit half-peeled and water running down his collarbones, laughing about a parrotfish that had followed him for 20 minutes like it wanted to be friends. "You used to hate getting in the water," Andres said, on the fourth day, handing Nacho a towel he didn't need to hand him. Nacho could have reached it himself, but Andres's hands had moved before his brain caught up. "I used to hate a lot of things about myself," Nacho said, quieter than the joke deserved. The water wasn't really one of them. That was just an easy thing to blame. Andres didn't ask what he meant. He thought he already knew, and the knowing sat heavy in his chest for the rest of the afternoon. SEO note for listener retention: mini reveal. That night, alone on the porch of his father's house, Andres found the box. It was pushed to the back of a closet shelf, dust thick enough that no one had touched it in years. Inside, every letter Nacho had ever written him, the early ones full and eager, the later ones shorter, sadder, and finally, the last one, dated almost 6 years ago, never opened. Andres's hands shook as he broke the seal. "I have to stop writing," it read, in Nacho's careful, slanted handwriting. "Not because I stopped caring. Because I can't keep pretending these are just letters between friends when what I feel for you isn't just friendship, and I'm scared that if I say that out loud, I lose you completely. I'd rather lose you slowly, in silence, than lose you all at once by telling the truth. I'm sorry. I hope you find someone who deserves you and isn't a coward like me." Andres sat on the porch step with that letter for a long time, the ocean breathing in and out in the dark below the bluff, 6 years of unopened truth sitting in his lap like something alive. He had spent 6 years thinking Nacho simply forgot about him. He had never imagined Nacho had been protecting him from a truth Andres had wanted to hear his entire life. The unopened letter changed something in Andres that he didn't know how to undo, and he didn't tell Nacho about it. Not yet. Some truths need the right weather to be spoken, and the weather that week was all wrong: hot, still, heavy, the kind of air that sat on the whole town like a held breath before a storm. The storm came on a Tuesday, faster than the forecasts predicted, the way storms sometimes did in that stretch of coastline where 3 currents fought each other for dominance. Andres and Nacho were 40 minutes from shore when the sky went the color of a bruise. "We need to get back," Andres said, already turning the wheel, already feeling the first hard gust shove the boat sideways. "We're not going to make it back," Nacho said, calm in the specific way people get when panic would be useless. "There's an old research shelter on Isla Cabrera. Half a mile. We can make that." They made it, barely, soaked through, the little concrete shelter shuddering with each gust as the storm tore across the water outside. The single room had a cot, a dead generator, and exactly one dry blanket, which Nacho immediately tried to give to Andres and Andres immediately tried to give back. "We'll share it," Andres said, and something about the practicality of the sentence didn't match the way his pulse was hammering. "You're the one who's actually cold." They sat pressed together on the narrow cot, the storm screaming outside, the blanket around both their shoulders, and for a long time neither of them said anything at all. Then Nacho said, so quiet it almost disappeared under the wind, "I read that you're engaged." Andres's throat closed. "It's complicated," he managed. "Is it, though?" Nacho turned his head, and in the dim emergency light his eyes looked older than Andres remembered, and sadder, and braver, all at once. "Or is it simple, and you're just scared of the simple answer?" "Nacho. I found out I loved you when we were 17, Nacho said, the words coming loose now like something that had been dammed up for years and finally broke. I've loved you every year since, even the years I told myself I didn't, even 3,000 kilometers away with an ocean and a whole life between us. I came back for the reef, Andres. I swear that's true. But I would be lying if I said some part of me didn't come back hoping. Andres's hands found the letter he'd tucked into his jacket pocket that morning without fully understanding why he'd brought it. He held it out, wordless, and watched Nacho's face change as he recognized his own handwriting, 6 years old, never delivered until now. I found it last night, Andres said, his voice breaking on the last word. You wrote that you'd rather lose me slowly than tell me the truth. Nacho, I've spent 6 years thinking you just forgot me. And this whole time you were protecting a truth I would have given anything to hear. You would have? Nacho's breath caught. I loved you too, Andres whispered. I didn't have the words for it at 17. I'm not sure I fully have them now. But I know what it felt like every time you left a room and I felt colder for it. I know I said yes to Marisol because it was the only door that didn't require me to admit what that coldness meant. The storm was still screaming outside. Neither of them noticed any more. Nacho's hand found Andres's jaw, gentle, questioning, giving him every chance to pull away. Andres didn't pull away. Their first kiss happened in a dark concrete shelter on an uninhabited island, 6 years and one unopened letter too late, with the whole ocean throwing itself against the walls outside, and it was, Andres would think later, the single most honest moment of his entire life. Emotional beat, hook for retention, but honesty on an island in a storm is easy. Honesty in a town that's been planning your wedding for 8 months is a different kind of storm entirely. They came back the next morning to a town already buzzing, not about the storm, which was ordinary, but about the fact that Andres Valdez and the Reyes boy had been missing together overnight, and everyone had an opinion about what that meant even before either man said a word. Marisol found Andres at the dock before his father did. She didn't yell. That almost made it worse. I've known for months, she said, arms crossed, more tired than angry. The way you look at him. The way you never looked at me, not once, not even trying to fake it for my sake. I would have understood if you'd told me the truth 8 months ago, Andres. What I can't understand is why you let me plan a wedding around a lie. I didn't know how to tell you the truth, Andres said, and it was the most honest sentence he'd said to her in 8 months. I didn't know how to tell myself. Do you know now? Andres looked past her, down the dock, to where Nacho was unloading dive equipment with his jaw tight and his eyes carefully not looking their way, giving Andres room to have this conversation without an audience. Yes, Andres said. I know now. Marisol nodded slowly, and something in her posture loosened, like she'd been carrying a weight she was relieved to finally set down. Then go tell your father before the whole town does it for you, she said. And Andres, for what it's worth, I hope this one's honest. You deserve that. So does he. His father did not take it well. Rigoberto Valdez had built his entire life on the idea that a man's worth was measured in what he could hand down, a boat, a business, a name, grandchildren to carry it forward. When Andres told him, standing in the boat shed with 60 years of nets and history hanging around them, his father went very quiet in a way that was worse than shouting. Your grandfather drowned building this family something to stand on, Rigoberto finally said. And you want to throw all of it away for a boy who's going to leave again the moment his research grant runs out. He's not a boy, Papa. He's a man. A good one. And I love him. Andres's voice shook but didn't break. I'm not throwing anything away. I'm choosing something real instead of something safe. Safe kept this family alive. Safe is also what almost made me marry a woman I don't love, to please a father who's never once asked what I actually wanted. Andres heard his own voice crack on that, 6 years of swallowed feelings finally spilling out in a boat shed that smelled like salt and diesel in his whole childhood. I'm done being safe, Papa. I'd rather be happy. Rigoberto didn't answer. He walked out of the shed and didn't speak to his son for 11 days. Mini cliffhanger for retention, but the silence between father and son wasn't the only storm brewing in Punta Serena, because 3 days later, Andres discovered exactly why his father had been so desperate to keep everything safe. It was Nacho who found the paperwork, actually spread across a folder in the harbor master's office where Andres' father had left it by mistake, permits and survey documents with Esteban Cardenas' development company letterhead across the top. A resort. 40 rooms, a private marina, a dredged channel straight through the healthiest section of the reef Nacho had spent 6 months trying to protect. And at the bottom of the proposal, a signature line with Rigoberto Valdez's name already signed, dated the week before the storm. He sold the shoreline rights, Nacho said, quiet with shock, holding the papers out to Andres with hands that weren't quite steady. Andres, this is going to kill the reef. Not slowly. In one dredging season. Andres stared at his father's signature like it belonged to a stranger. That's why he wanted the wedding rushed, he said slowly, pieces falling together with sick clarity. Marisol's father owns the trucking company that would move the construction materials. My marriage wasn't just about respectability. It was about locking in Cardenas' deal with 2 families instead of 1. Andres. I have to talk to him. Andres' jaw was tight, his eyes bright with something between grief and fury. This town's whole life depends on that reef. My grandfather died on this water and my father wants to sell the thing that keeps it alive. The confrontation happened in front of half the town, at the little harbor cafe where Rigoberto took his coffee every morning without fail. You sold the reef, Andres said, no preamble, the folder slapping down on the table hard enough to rattle the cups. You sold the thing every family in this town depends on, to a man who doesn't care if Punta Serena survives the decade, and you did it in secret because you knew I would never let you. The cafe had gone silent. Every fisherman in the room was listening now. I did it for this family's future, Rigoberto said, low, defensive, but his eyes weren't quite steady either. No, Andres said. You did it because you're scared. Just like I was scared. You're scared this town is dying, that the fish are thinner every year, that the boats are getting older and nobody's kids want this life anymore, so you took the easy money instead of fighting for something harder and better. His voice cracked, not with weakness now but with conviction. I understand being scared, Papa. I was engaged to a woman I didn't love because I was scared too. But I stopped being scared. I think it's time you did the same. Rigoberto said nothing. But for the first time in 11 days, he looked at his son, really looked, instead of past him. Turning point, hook for retention, what happened next wasn't a shouting match. It was something far more powerful, the whole town deciding, together, what kind of future they actually wanted. Nacho organized a town meeting 3 nights later at the fish market, presenting 6 months of reef data to a room of fishermen who'd never seen a slide projector but understood, instantly and viscerally, what the coral won't recover meant for their children's future.